Where'd you?
In grad school, I went to Denmark, Copenhagen, and undergrad, I went to Tanzania.
My grandmother was born there.
Really? Oh, wait, you, okay. I was talking.
Okay, welcome everybody out there in Zoom land, and welcome to session, I think we're at 7 now, of the course on sustainable business, sustainable economies. We have a guest today, Lisa DeLude, who is director of the UW Sustainability Office. And because our guest is the UW one in particular, I want to begin with the UW Tribal Land Acknowledgement today. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot Nation. Lisa has been at UW for about a year, so almost exactly a year, so long enough to acclimate herself to what the university is like, for better or worse, having had previous experience in the world of government. She is, as I said, director of the UW Sustainability Office, so involved in all kinds of very different ways with what's going on with regard to sustainability across and beyond campus, for that matter. And so having her here today as somebody who has those two kinds of background experiences and which intersects in really, I think, interesting ways with the kinds of business sustainability issues we've been talking about, I think will be really interesting. So Lisa is going to begin with a few slides and then Q&A, where really hard questions. Again, reminder, when you talk to the owl and speak up if you're here in person. Okay, so welcome, Lisa.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you. Everybody, it was fun to just get a chance to meet a few of the people here in person while we were waiting. So like you said, I've been here for about a year. I wanted to just sort of talk a little bit about the UW Sustainability Office and what we do. And by the way, at any point, feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. I think sometimes that's better just to make sure you don't forget your question, clarify things as we go. So this is our current office. We have one vacant position, which isn't listed here, which we're in the process of filling. We're a small but mighty group. And we also have a great group of interns. And I guess I'd say I like to think of our sustainability office, and this was the same way I thought of the sustainability office that I led at Snohomish County Government, as sort of a hub. And we're a hub with connecting a lot of different spokes on a bigger wheel. And I think without sort of that central glue or that central connection, not only to connect people on issues, but I think we also fill a lot of holes in policy and process that organizations are often missing. So I'm going to have Marilyn, who's one of our on our team, is amazing with visual graphic and information visualization. So I need her to create a pretty cool visual with the hub and the spoke model. But that's sort of like what I like to think of as far as how our office functions. And I'm going to talk about some of our core functions today, just sort of as project highlights. One of which is the Sustainability Action Plan. Did any of you know that UW has a Sustainability Action Plan? Oh, amazing. This is
Just because I told them.
okay. All right. Because I've done a few other presentations at like nutrition seminars and stuff, and no one had any idea. So I'd say that's sort of a core function of our office is the strategic plan with how do we set our goals, how do we reach our goals, and then what are the specific strategies and actions to get there. Otherwise, it's just a plan on a shelf, and that's not what I signed up for. I think another core function typically of sustainability offices is carbon emissions and accounting. And that's something that I'm going to talk about today. And then, you know, some other areas that I often find organizations aren't set up to really do. So addressing things like green building, addressing things like processes in procurement, for example. So a lot of these are sort of addressed in one way or another in our sustainability action plan. But I just wanted to give you sort of a flavor of some of the things that we do. So topics that I'm going to cover today, talk a little bit about the action plan, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sustainability vision, mission, and commitment for UW, and then a few of our priority projects. So a greenhouse gas emissions inventory and analysis, a carbon roadmap, decarbonizing the Seattle campus power plant, and the green building standard. There's a lot of other things going on, but you know, unless I was here with you for 5 hours, you'd all fall asleep. We'll just we'll hit on a couple of these and happy to chat with you about other things down the road. So it's great that you all are aware that we have a sustainability action plan. The first one was adopted in 2020. Gary was integral part of that, and other folks from POE. We have 10 targets for the sustainability action plan. This was created through a pretty robust community engagement process in terms of establishing the 10 targets. There's strategies, specific strategies underneath each of these 10 targets. And then under those strategies, there's specific action items that are sort of assigned, or there's a lead, a lead unit that could be facilities, that could be program on the environment, that could be UW medicine. So this was created, and I think it's a great start. There's a few things that we want to address. We're getting ready to update the sustainability action plan, and I'm gonna talk about that in a minute. But I did forget to mention two of the key components of our office that help us get these strategic plans in place or strategic processes changed are our Environmental Stewardship Committee, which Gary is a member of. So that's this committee that really has broad representation across the university. So medicine is represented. We have multiple deans on that committee. We have multiple VPs, the VP of facilities, VP of finance, VP of diversity and minority affairs. And that's really important. That group and the broad representation is really important, not only to raise the level of awareness. Some people without that committee, might not even be aware that we have a strategic action plan, but it's also a process of creating ownership and buy-in. So what we don't want is to create a strategic plan that our office is then sort of, for 5 people, right, left with implementing. That's not going to be successful. So that committee is particularly important. And we actually have an executive order and a charge from the president for the creation of that committee, and for that committee to be a sort of a responsible body or a responsible actor in creating the plan, implementing the plan, and then providing updates to the Board of Regents and the president. So that's one of our committees. And then we also have a executive committee that's really responsible for implementing the sustainability action plan. So that also has a broad representation of committee members, folks from housing and human services. We have a number of VPs on that committee as well, deans and faculty. And both of those that meets monthly. Both of those are really key to our success with implementing the plan and updating the plan. Okay. So I mentioned that we're on a 5-year cycle to update the plan. A few things that we really want to address when we update it this next round is to make sure that we're looking at building a plan and building targets, goals and targets that are established based on best available science. So are you all familiar with the IPCC? Did you discuss that? Okay, great. So that's, an example of, they just came out with their latest assessment report, and we really want to make sure if we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, that we don't pick some random number out of the air, right? If we as a university as a whole want to reduce our carbon emissions, we want to make sure that we're following the best available science. So we do actually look, there's some really specific tables in the IPCC reports that say, really everybody, governments, businesses, you need to reduce your emissions by this % over this baseline year in order for us to avert this climate crisis. So that's one piece. We also really want the plan. One of the things I noticed was I didn't feel like the goals and targets were really bold and reflected the urgency that's needed to address this climate crisis. And I like to say, is UW alone, if we say we get to 100% carbon neutrality, are we going to be able to, solve the climate crisis alone? No, but that's exactly what everyone needs to do, right, to make this change, to make change and to solve the crisis. So individual action and agency action is important. The other piece that we want to address is scope gaps. So if you looked at those 10 different targets, there's some areas that we don't really cover as a university. So climate adaptation and resiliency, natural resources as a whole is kind of missing as a topical area. Waste, and specifically single-use plastics, is something I'd like to see us address in a more strategic way. Purchasing for sure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. We also want the plan to be a little more inclusive. So I think we could do a better job of including all 3 campuses. We have the Tacoma and Athol campus. We've been successful in bringing medicine on board as we sort of gear up to update the plan, and they're a huge part of the university and a huge part of the budget. And athletics and housing and food services are already parts of that plan, but I think we could pull out some bigger areas of opportunity in the next go around. And the last thing is really, again, trying to do a better job of addressing where we have policy gaps. Then also for each of these action items, what are the resources that we're going to need? Because if we just address an action, you know, whatever that might be, and we don't say how much it's going to cost or if we need staff or people to do it, again, it's sort of just an action that sits on a shelf and we hope somebody does it. We hope it gets done magically, which is not what we want. A few of the other things that we've identified that we want to get sort of in place before we update the sustainability action plan is a clear vision and mission for the university. We want to make sure that we're all sort of swimming in the same direction and united around the same goal. I know that can be sort of a snore for some people and like, I don't totally get it. You know, why do we need to spend time on this language, which I'll show you in a minute, but it is really important because we go back to that and we use that and remind ourselves where we're trying to get to. The other piece is a sustainability commitment. So one of the things that we're working on currently, it's in process with that environmental stewardship committee that I mentioned. Gary's part of that, in partnership with the faculty council on campus planning and stewardship, is a resolution. Right now it's in draft form, but it's a resolution to really build more awareness, bring the university's sustainability commitment to a higher level. So we actually want to commit to carbon neutrality for scope 1 and 2 emissions by a certain date. Right now we're proposing 2030. We want to sort of direct certain agencies through that resolution, certain agencies and groups to be recognized as one of the central hubs to move the plan forward, the sustainability action plan forward and meet our goals. So that's pretty exciting to me because without that commitment, we might find ourselves in these committees spending a lot of time working on this stuff, and then people are like, well, do you have the authority? You know, do you have the authority to move this forward? This is a big university-wide change, as an example. Or if somebody coming from UW Medicine or Housing and Athletics and saying, I had no idea that this was a thing. I had no idea we were working on this. So we really want to try to raise the visibility and level of commitment. Then we want to go through a robust, probably multi-year effort to update the plan with those bold targets and urgency. And the plan we really want to address, if we had to put it in 3 buckets, 3 general buckets. So research, academics, and learning, right? We'd graduate around 80,000 students a year. You all will be change makers in whatever you choose to do. It doesn't have to be in the sustainability field. I'll talk about that in a minute. We want to impact operations here at UW, and I'm going to talk about that more too, as well as campus partnerships. So things like Earth Lab that are huge that Ben leads. So we did spend some time about a year ago coming up with a sustainability vision and mission statement for UW. And that's really central, as I mentioned, is to making sure that all of our strategies, all of our goals, all of our actions are aligned with that vision. So I won't read the whole thing, but I do want to draw your attention to the bolded words. So we really want to interweave sustainability in everything we do. I'm guessing you've talked a little about intersectional sustainability, and it's not just about the environment. It's not just about any one thing or any one field. So we want to interweave it. We want to take that bold action, and we want to act with urgency. How are we going to do that? So we also spent some time creating a mission statement that says we really want to address the EDI role and responsibility that the UW in particular plays when we talk about sustainability. So addressing and acknowledging environmental harm and inequities. We want to drive innovative solutions. We want to reinforce that urgency that we really don't have time to sort of kick the tires and make incremental change, right? And then we also want to try and translate learning into action and create more opportunities for students to gain the experience, and the skills they want, again, to be those change makers out in the world. So we spent some time on this, probably a couple months, not solely for a whole hour, but I think it's important, and we do go back and use, so these are on our website. I talked touched briefly on this, but I love this graphic. Marilyn made a lot of these graphics, but I think it really emphasizes just the potential that UW has to really address sustainability and sustainability issues, right? We graduate 18,000 students each year. You all are going off, and no matter what you do, if you work for a company, a large company, if you work in purchasing, if you're a mechanic, there are opportunities to use safer chemicals. There's opportunities to change how you buy and procure things. There's opportunity no matter what field you're in. And so we feel like we have, we're R1 research institution, and we're doing amazing things, but there's a lot of opportunity to really up our game and address this in a bolder way. So one of the questions I asked our two committees when I got here is, all right, we're taking a step back and we're looking at sustainability across this huge organization that's essentially, UW is like its own city. And I'll talk about some of our infrastructure in a minute here. But let's really start to think about what we want. Where do we want to be in 5 years? Where do we want to be in 20 years? Where do we want to be in 100 years? Because I think you need to spend time imagining the future that you want in order to work backwards and start setting those goals and targets along with your scientific data, and then creating those strategies and action items to get there. And it's pretty fun, right? It's fun to think about what the future could be. And it's also realistic. So we've talked about a lot of these things over the last year, and I'm thinking a lot of them will be incorporated into the updated plan, but a student sustainability committee is something that we're working on. Campus is a living lab, really trying to center equity and BIPOC leadership and sustainability as a whole. It is still predominantly white field. Energy efficient buildings, more sustainability degrees and program offerings. Carbon commitment, we're working on that. I talked about that. Anyway, you get the idea. Transitioning off of fossil fuels, electrifying our fleet. There's a lot of things that we can and should be doing and that we need to do at a faster rate. And then where do we want to be in 20 years? I put endowment on here because it's a huge piece of our potential. Stanford, I want to say about a year ago, made a huge announcement that they got $1.6 billion in gifted funds for a new sustainability school, for programming, for operations. Why not UW, right? Why not go after that? But if we don't think about it in a strategic way and put it into our plan, who's gonna own that and make that happen? You know, in 20 years, I hope we are totally carbon neutral for all of our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We could be meeting the living building challenge, running on 100% renewable and clean energy, have, you know, really expanded our research and partnerships, be producing no waste. What if we had all compostable, you know, everything? So I think it's important to imagine where you want to be and then try to work backwards for that, to achieve that future. Okay, no questions in the chat? So
Nothing yet.
Okay. So I wanted to touch on a few of our priority projects. We'll talk about 4 of them. Have you all covered scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? Yeah, okay, great. So I don't need to explain those. Again, another great Maryland graphic.
Go ahead, just really quickly. Not everybody knows.
Oh, okay, great. So scope 1 emissions, we typically talk about as direct emissions. And, you know, in simple terms, it's often fossil fuels that we burn, for like natural gas for space and water heating, gasoline in our vehicles, for example, or our fleet, we're talking about UW. Scope 2 emissions is usually talking about electricity. We're really lucky here in the Pacific Northwest with Seattle City Light that we're predominantly hydropower from dams, and that's considered clean energy. There's other trade-offs with salmon, right? But it's considered clean energy. And then scope 3, we refer to as indirect emissions. Those are emissions that are largely out of our control, sort of. But those are things like commuting. How do you get to work into school? Professional travel, which is an area that UW has a lot of emissions from. If you think about all the conferences people go to, all the research trips that faculty make, et cetera. Emissions from solid waste, right? It gets trucked out and it goes somewhere, often put into a landfill. methane is released, and then all the goods and services that we purchase. So before we update the sustainability action plan, we've hired a consultant to do a full scale greenhouse gas emissions inventory and analysis for scope 1, 2, and 3. So a lot of scope 1 and 2, the university has to by law report to the state and federal government every year, and we do that. We also have to report on commuting, but we've never looked at emissions from goods and services purchased. And I don't know if this is part of the coursework or curriculum, but often the scope 3 emissions, the goods and services purchased and everything else is one of a company, a city, a municipality's biggest sources of emissions. So I think this is going to be a pretty interesting report, and it will be out in a couple months. And it will definitely open up the the discussion for updating the plan. That's what we want to address. One of the other things that we're working on is a carbon roadmap. So if we want to be carbon neutral by 2050, we really want to be deliberate about, again, those strategies, actions, and actually quantifying the metrics with how we get there. So part of that information will be informed by that greenhouse gas emissions inventory and analysis that I just mentioned. But we are literally going through in a document with scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions with each unit and each campus, and starting to just have sort of early discussions with each of those units. How do you heat your buildings if we don't already know how they heat their buildings? You know, how many power tools does facilities have? Leaf blowers, lawn mowers, weed eaters, sort of smaller groups of emissions. How much food do we haul off campus each year? How much food waste do we have? So we're starting to lay out at least the categories and areas of understanding. And the idea is that this will be sort of an iterative document that that not only identifies what we need to do, but it will have certain deadlines. So we want to be able to reduce emissions from a certain area by X% by 2030, and then another X% by 2040. So this will be a really important document moving forward, and assign owners, like who's responsible for each action. So I don't know if you all have talked about campus infrastructure. But has everyone, do you know where the power plant is on campus? Yeah. You know that big green stack if you're walking on the Burke? Is it that way?
Is it right next to the computer science building?
It's
Pretty on the side of the building, on the opposite side of campus, right?
Yeah, it's on the opposite side of campus. So if you're walking on the Burke Gilman, have you ever seen the sort of the waterfalls? Yeah. So that's the condensate from the cooling towers, and then there's a big green stack that emissions come out of. So we burn natural gas in that plant. We burn a ton of natural gas, not actually a ton, I'll give you the that would be nothing. Yeah, we burn a lot of natural gas in that plant to provide heat for space heating for almost all the buildings on campus, as well as heating our water. We also, and we do that by actually burning natural gas and producing steam, and steam goes out. Yeah.
Why do we not use the city? Like, why do we have our own power plant?
Well, we use the city's electricity, but typically when you're heating, so for all of our electricity
Heating stuff is okay.
yeah,
It's not electric.
right, exactly. Yeah, great question. Yeah, and it's definitely, you know, the technology is there. We'll talk about it a little bit. Great question though, to provide commercial space heating electrically, but typically it's been done through natural gas, largely because natural gas prices have been so cheap. So there's not really been an incentive or a regulatory push for UW to move off of natural gas. Anyway, so we create steam. That steam goes out into about 8 miles of tunnels that go all underneath the campus. They go into each individual building, and that's why the building's warm. We also provide central cooling through that plant and another, the West Cup plant. And not every building has air conditioning, but we still provide a lot of cooling for different needs, as well as air conditioning. Anyway, long story short, the natural gas that we burn at the power plant is really significant. It's 93% of UW's reportable scope 1 and 2 emissions. It costs a lot of money. and it's actually costing a lot more money lately. Have you guys been following the passage of the Climate Commitment Act, Washington State's Climate Commitment Act? Some of you, it's pretty new and big legislation that just passed. And it basically says if you're a big polluter in Washington State, you're burning fossil fuels over a floor, over a certain amount, you have to pay to be an emitter. And so UW is one of those that has to pay. So the floor is 25,000 metric tons of CO2e, and we emit about 86,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we paid an extra 4.5 million as an organization to be emitters. So we now have a financial and a regulatory incentive to move off of natural gas. And because of that, we've been partnering our office, sort of connected at the hip with our campus energy and utilities, unit to develop a strategy to get the steam plant off of natural gas and electrify it. We've been doing a lot of tours. I hope you guys, if you're interested, you can come on a tour and check it out. It's pretty neat actually to see the power plant. But we want to, I'll make sure to speed up a little bit so we have time for questions. But we have a couple things that we want to address, some of which we've already talked about with transitioning off of fossil fuels. The first is emissions, obviously. The second is energy consumption. So we actually the intensity of our energy use, often referred to as EUI or energy use intensity, is about double of that of our peers. So if we look at other R1 research institutions, it is double. Part of that's probably the price of natural gas here compared to other, universities might have more expensive electricity, they might have more expensive natural gas. So we know that there's a ton of opportunity to use less energy. And that's kind of the thing I always like to say is let's eat our energy efficiency vegetables before we do like our renewables dessert. So it's the most cost-effective way typically in the Northwest to reduce your energy consumption is energy efficiency. So that's retrofits and behavior change and operation and maintenance change. We also have some electrical capacity constraints here at campus. So we are sort of at the maximum service load from Seattle City Light. We're at our, what we call N+1 redundancy electrical capacity. So if we reduce our energy, basically wasted energy, if we reduce that, we'll have a little bit more electrical capacity. But we will have to definitely address that. And we do in this 5-part strategy to ensure that we have enough electricity coming to campus to go from fossil fuels to a fully electric heat and hot water system. You still with me? You guys all still with me? Okay. And then the other piece is we have a lot of really old infrastructure in the plant. So if you come on a tour, and I hope you do, shoot me an email if you want to go, you will see boilers that are 20, 40, 50 years old, really outdated controls, really outdated data. We have some newer ones. But we're going to have to spend, 20, 30, $40 million anyway to replace that equipment. If we're going to do that, why not do it the smart way, right? And electrify it and spend that money on clean energy. So in a nutshell, this is our sort of 5-part strategy. Energy efficiency, convert to hot water. So right now that steam is really, really hot. And in order to put in heat pumps, commercial heat pumps, which run on electricity, we need to lower the temperature that basically the system runs on, and we can do that through hot water loops rather than steam. We also want to provide central cooling. So we want to replace inefficient chillers. I won't get into some of the other options that we're looking at, more complex options, but one of the neat things that we can also do with central cooling is basically have energy storage when we need it. So if we have a really hot day, we often cannot provide cooling to all of the buildings on campus. The electrical demand is just too high. But if we're able to store chilled water and or hot water, depending on the season, we will actually be able to gain some storage capacity, some thermal capacity to provide that service to more of the campus. I mentioned heat pumps, so electrify the heating. So after we've done a couple of these things, 1, 2, and 3, then we'd actually put in heat pumps that can run on the hot water loop. And then we've got this final push that's still a little bit TBD. How do we do this? And the reason I say that is because we use a lot of the steam from the current plant for sterilization and autoclave for the medical center for UW's hospital. That can be an electric. You can electrify for autoclave, steam and sterilization, but we haven't, by that point, this is probably a full 20-year timeline. This is probably 6 years-ish. There'll probably be a lot more technology out there for us to make that last push to zero carbon. Okay, so that was a quick snippet of the power plant. We're also working on updating UW's green building standard. So right now we have a pretty simple standard that is a requirement, UW's own requirement to build, the most environmentally green building that we can. Where we think there's some gaps though with that right now, and so it's going to be a little more expansive, a little more robust. We're in the process of updating it. We want it to address new construction and major renovations, as well as minor renovations and HVAC retrofits, so heating, ventilation, air conditioning retrofits. Because right now, the standard really just applies to new construction. And UW has basically said, we have all the space we need, particularly after COVID. Most of our space is underutilized. We really want to, both for financial purposes and for environmental purposes, where it makes sense, we want to renovate rather than build new buildings. That's right. In terms of environmental sustainability, the best new building to build is the one you already have and renovate it. So it will address those areas. We also want to have targets for different categories, so we don't currently address. So we want to have targets that buildings need to meet for both operational energy, so that the natural gas I just talked about, burning natural gas is operational energy, and then also embodied energy. Did you guys talk about what embodied carbon is? Some of you do, some of you don't. So in a nutshell, it would be the bones of this building are steel, or the bones and there's a lot of concrete. There's a lot of energy used in the making of those products. They have to ship often across the continent or across the globe. So there's a ton of embodied emissions in building materials. And I have another slide that will talk a little bit more about that. But we want to have targets for all of these different categories: energy, waste, water. We also want to think about equity and social justice in the design of the space. And then we also want to make sure that we have a process for financing and budgeting those buildings. Oftentimes what happens is you get, whether it's the College of the Environment or medicine saying, we want all of these things, this building to do all of these things. That's sort of called the building program. And then you have a budget, right? You have a budget that's sort of been developed through an approximate dollars per square foot. And so in the past, where UW has sometimes struggled, we've built a lot of amazing, LEED Gold, LEED Platinum buildings, but you end up removing sort of green items, which I think there's a misconception that they're an add-on rather than should be integrated into the process, because you have, your initial capital budget sort of butting heads with your operational budget. So, for example, if you put in really efficient HVAC equipment, you have the potential to save a lot of money for the university over the life of that building or the life of the equipment. But if you're not thinking creatively about how to get that into your original capital investment, basically the initial building of the building, you're going to sacrifice probably an incremental savings at the front end for what could have been a lot of savings over the life of the building. So we're trying to address that problem. Okay. I think I'll do this one pretty quickly. I want to make sure we got time for questions. So the Green Building Standard will also address tools for implementation, life cycle cost analysis, which is basically what I just talked about, really making sure we make a smart long-term decision for the UW. Looking at our processes so things don't get overlooked or missed with our project development group. And then making sure that we address any policy gaps, which was a lot of what I talked about at the beginning. So that this stuff actually happens, that we don't just say, we hope we can do it. The Carbon Leadership Forum Are you guys familiar with the Carbon Leadership Forum? It's a sort of a research body, nonprofit here at UW. So they do pretty amazing work. It's a sort of a baby born from Kate Simonin, who's in the College of the Built Environment, Simonin. But this, I think, just does a great job of showing the impact of embodied carbon. So basically the emissions in all of the building materials in a building versus the operational carbon. So you can see an operational carbon, again, is like the natural gas we burn to heat the building. So the CLF, the Carbon Leadership Forum, has basically done a ton of research that shows that the embodied carbon of a building, before anybody enters the building, you know, it could be day 100, the building is complete, they cut the ribbon, nobody's in it yet, but half of the building emissions have already been emitted because somebody had to make that steel, that concrete, transport it. So these are, one way I like to think about it is embodied carbon or emissions that are happening right now. And you could also make the argument that they're more urgent to address, and operational emissions are those that are emitted over the course of the building's lifetime. So I think it's pretty cool, I think, that we're addressing this and trying to create a new green building standard around it. All right, good. I'm doing better on time than I thought. So I like Marilyn created this, and I think it's just a really nice wrap-up slide, again, about how we really want to have that strong vision and commitment, and why it matters. You know, if we think about all the things, all the reasons why the stuff I just talked about matter to the university, we're leading and inspiring. You know, you all are and will be future leaders or change makers in the world, and whatever you do. It's supporting research. There's tons of opportunity for those living lab opportunities. We're focusing on equity. We're supporting ecosystems and natural ecosystems, avoiding penalties, hopefully. So I talked about the Climate Commitment Act and the allowances that we pay. A lot of this saves money, which we talked about, particularly with building and operations, and then supporting, you know, UW's core mission of education. So I think that's all I got. Questions?
I have two key questions for you. The first one is, you've talked a lot about goals and planning for the future. What are you doing, like, what is the UW sustainability division doing right now?
Right now,
Mhm.
well, we're working on all those projects I just talked about.
Oh, sorry, those are current projects.
Yes, those are
Sorry, I
current
missed that.
projects. So all of those things are in process. So we're, you know, for example, for the green building standard, we have a committee. We're working regularly to have focus groups with that committee and the consultant. So we'll have a focus group on energy, and we're actually getting really into the weeds on what the energy code requires, what LEED, which is a certification, a third-party building certification, requires. And we have all the subject matter experts and people from facilities and people from UW Medicine, manage UW Medicine's facilities. And we're talking about what should the standard be? You know, what should our EUI target, be for a building? What should our carbon or GHG target be for a building? So we're spending time doing that. It's a lot of meeting and facilitation of committees. All the projects I just mentioned are in process, and we go through a lot of discussion on yay or nay and where are we missing the mark, and et cetera, et cetera.
And then my other question real quick was, going into this, a lot of us didn't know that you guys even existed. And you talked earlier about wanting to do more like outreach and increase like visibility and stuff. Why haven't you before? And like, what is your plan for that going forward?
Yeah. Oh man, I would love to have more people know about us. Well, like I said, I think we do have a communications manager. So we have a website with a ton of great information that I think was on the very first introductory slide. We have a newsletter. I'm trying to get out more and more to classes like this, just so that, you know, to create that awareness. But, you know, one of the obstacles, I think, is just the size of our team. You know, we've got 5 people and we're trying to do all these projects, and So anyway, yeah, if you have ideas for the help, let me know. I would, all ears. I'd love to look at your ideas. Yeah, thanks. Good questions. Yeah.
I was wondering, like, for when you retrofit and like renovate the buildings, but like, how do you guys sustainably manage the waste that comes from all that? Like, if you replace all the light bulbs, how do you like avoid them just going to like a landfill?
Yeah, really good question. Well, I guess it's King County has, and we're in King County and Seattle as well, have some specific requirements about waste from construction and how it needs to be managed. For certain things, like the light bulbs you mentioned, if they're fluorescents, hopefully, you know, most of the UW has been retrofitted with LEDs, but if they're fluorescents, they have mercury, which is a hazardous substance. So there's federal and state laws that we have to comply with for certain hazardous materials like that. And then I know that King County also requires material separation in a construction and demolition process. So, you know, there's specific specs about if you're removing wood, and that wood is not, you know, blanking on the word, 5, 6 o'clock at night, things leave my brain. Anyway, you know, there's certain specs that you have to separate and actually bring to a different facility and that aren't allowed to go to the landfill. So I'd say a lot of that is, well, there's a lot that's specified in code or different local or state regulations. And I think there's also a lot of opportunity to do more. Yeah, King County has a whole division, and a friend of mine that talks just about deconstruction of buildings and how to do it in a smarter way. So yeah, great question.
I have a
Yeah.
quick follow-up.
Yeah.
When they go to those special facilities, are they like recycled, or like what happens to them?
Some of it is. So I know that a lot of the wood and drywall can be recycled. It also depends. Like, you know, a lot of this is also, it depends. Sometimes you think you can reuse the drywall or the gypsum and it actually has, you know, asbestos in it or whatnot. So I'd like to say there's a rigorous system in place for all that. And I think that's probably a little bit of an overstatement. I think there's a lot of good systems in place, but also a lot of, it's hard to enforce. It's hard to monitor and enforce on a job site. Big question. Yeah.
Concerning like the infrastructure of the UW buildings, since we have like so many buildings that are like in that sort of like Victorian Gothic style, and that like a lot of people value the aesthetic, even though they're very old. Do you ever have to sort of balance like, you know, remodeling buildings and sustainability with like preserving history?
Yeah, really good question. It happens a lot. And actually, I went to this conference. It's called SCUP, Society on Campus and University Planning, which I just found out was an organization when I came here. But I went to, you know, was on a panel at that conference, but I went to a number of sessions that were actually they wanted to get rid of a building part that was sort of brutalist architecture, like in my opinion, really ugly, like heavy concrete, very little natural light. I want to say this was at the University of Alaska. And they said, you know, they battled with the city because it was a historic building. But, you know, first, the university was arguing that it was just ugly and not conducive to good learning. And then the Alaskan Native community also just said, we as Indigenous people find this sort of offensive. It's, and I, you know, without getting into sort of all the arguments that they brought, which I think were well-founded, they're actually able to demolish it. So there was sort of a historic preservation attempt because of its age, but it does happen a lot. Yeah. And sometimes it can be tricky. I know where I worked in Snohomish County, we had to preserve the entire shell of a historic building. And actually had to buy, you know, some recreated 1900 windows, 1900 railings, but renovated the entire inside, and it was still considered a historic building. So yeah, there's ways to address it. Yeah.
Have any of your project proposals been shot down by you?
By you, Doug?
Tough question.
Good, tough question. So honestly, no, not yet. Not yet. Is this real wood? Maybe not. Find some real wood. No, I think you know, I think a lot of, and I want to say a lot of that is due to just really good communication with my team, with other folks on those two committees, where if we're talking about whether it's updating the green building standard, creating a carbon roadmap, working on that resolution, we're doing a lot of talking to say we're trying to balance what we want to accomplish with potential political obstacles or political feasibility, or, you know, is our goal to get this adopted perfectly, but we know it'll take 5 years, or should we make some sacrifices on the language and, you know, get this adopted in a year, that kind of thing. So yeah, so far now, there's a lot of negotiation and discussion.
Is there anything like big or radical that you personally would love to see, but you know, isn't politically feasible, and therefore is it something you're working on?
Yes. I mean, I'd love to see all of our buildings be meet the living building challenge. Have any of you been to the Bullitt Center downtown? Okay, cool. It's sort of a whole level above LEED Platinum. So anyway, you could check it out. But a really sort of regenerative building would be one thing. I'd also really love to see us, we're sort of moving in this direction, but I don't think UW is ready to make the leap yet. So I talked about space, right? And that facilities is really trying to focus on really sharing space in a better way and renovating and reusing the space that already exists. I think probably at any business or any organization, there's a lot of, I think space can result in some entitlement. People feeling entitled to, I want this big office, you know, or this is our building and these are our showers. And we're really trying to, I'd love to see us move away from that. And I think it also helps reduce the silos. Like, what if you were over using the astronomy building to study? Like, it's not the astronomy building, it's the University of Washington's building, happens to be teaching astronomy and physics, and vice versa, right? And I think that would, it would do a lot for relationship building and those silos, but it would also do a lot for sustainability, particularly after COVID. Like a number of universities, my supervisor, he has to actually work on this, our deferred maintenance and space plan. And he said, you know, University of Missouri is my hero. They basically said they want a net decrease in their space, largely because they can't afford it. Building these buildings are very, very expensive, new buildings. And we're not occupying the space anymore. You know, half of you are joining hello remotely. A lot of staff and faculty are offering more hybrid options. So, and you know, there's even been, I think, an article in the paper today about look at all the vacant commercial space downtown. So that's another thing I'd love to see us doing, because that is a really big piece of our carbon footprint. The last thing I would say that we're working on that I didn't mention is, so we've got a good chunk of our emissions that come from travel, specifically air travel. We've got a working group, Gary's been part of this actually for years. We're trying to introduce, the idea of a sort of a surcharge, because a surcharge that would go into directly offsetting UW emissions. Perhaps, you know, one of the things that we think would be best is having it go to a pot of money to hopefully speed up our transition off of fossil fuels at the steam plant. And I actually think that we will get something through, that will pass, because I think everybody realizes this is, in a lot of ways, you can talk about flying as a privilege, right? There's a lot of people that don't get to fly. It has environmental justice and equity impacts. So I think we'll get something through, but there's a lot of things like that are just, it's a difficult discussion. You got to be up for difficult and uncomfortable discussions, and that's sort of what I like most of the time. But yeah, good question.
Feel free to demolish our building at any point, and if there's something better, we would not mind at all.
Yeah. You know, I will say one last thing, and then I know you guys want to head out. So I've been, you know, doing in this similar role. I was at Snohomish County government for 12 years. And I'd say that it's been really neat to see and encouraging to see the evolution of sustainability over that time. So when I started in my role, it was a temporary role at Snohomish County for 3 years. I couldn't talk about climate change. I couldn't really say climate change. It was very controversial. We had 5 council members, county council members, 3 of whom are traditionally sort of, I'd say environmentally friendly, often 2 positions that were more on the conservative side, and was really directed by the county executive to not say climate change. Let's talk about environmental stewardship. And most of what I worked on was energy efficiency and demonstrating a financial payback for the county to sort of justify my existence. And I think we've moved, in a lot of ways, moved beyond that. And you've had presentations on sustainable business where, you know, compared to, we still need to always look at the dollars and cents and widgets that we create or whatever, but I see I'm much more hopeful that we've moved beyond that, and people are really recognizing beyond, you know, the need for this work beyond just the bottom line, bottom line.
I'm gonna sneak one last question in.
Yeah.
Moderator privilege. Having spent time in both government and now in academia, in terms of how you go about making change and what it takes to accomplish that and everything, has it seemed pretty much the same or different in significant ways?
Oh, that's a great one. You know, no, it seems very different. So, and that's one of the things I'm still getting used to, that's still really different here, is that in county government, there was a really clear process for how you move stuff forward. So if we had a new ordinance, which is basically county code or city code, we had sort of a very defined process for the most part, where you create it, you know, you make sure it was okay with the executive branch, which is what I worked under. You'd bring it to council, it would get discussed in committee, and then it would go to the full council for a vote. And, you know, sometimes there were amendments, sometimes there weren't, but there was a clear process. You know, there was time for public input, opportunities for public input, and the university is much more of this very, I guess I will just say, messy and convoluted community governance process, you know, where we've got students are our stakeholders and constituents, faculty are stakeholders and constituents, the administration, the board of regents. So we have to move a lot of this stuff forward through all these different bodies in parallel and make sure everybody's aware. So I'm still getting used to it. I'm still not sure there's a, you know, sort of a standard way to do it, but we're getting there.
Yeah, there's no playbook.
Yeah, no playbook.
Okay, I'm gonna let all of you depart if you want, and thank Lisa again for being here, and really, also, Lisa really has kind of supercharged the sustainability office since she got here. Timing is really important. She arrived at a good time, but taking advantage of those opportunities. She has done